So I'm going to talk a little bit today just generally about a very quotidian, everyday experience that gives a general perception about public perceptions about AI, and then talk about two contexts that I worked in last year and this year. One being hosting a designer-led conversation about AI with a group of folks, and then work I do involving machine learning in healthcare. So this is just to kind of set up the talk. Last September, I was trying to go from here to Poznan in Poland, but Hurricane Florence really screwed up how I was trying to get there. So I couldn't, airports were closed, and I kind of entered into this Sisyphean circle of hell. And unfortunately, the audio isn't working on this, but I recorded myself on the phone trying to change my flight, and what they're actually saying here is explaining to me that stay on the line and that I was 28th in line. And when you're trying to get out of the country in 4 hours, that was a little bit frightening. So I began to think, well, that's crazy. How can I be 28th in line? Maybe it's because I've never flown with this Polish airline before. Maybe it's because I was kind of pissy in one of the messages I left earlier. I was just trying to work out, there's no way there can be this many people in front of me. But then I started thinking about this, and this is a case where you can't also hear the audio here, but I think folks are familiar with Dr. Dow, who was forcibly removed from a plane after he'd already checked in on United. And this is quite the audio in this is quite disturbing, because people on the plane are completely kind of flummoxed as somebody who is checked in, sitting in their seat, is being forcibly removed from the plane. So straight away, I guess going with some of the folk theories, people started having some perception, like, why was this gentleman selected and so, treated so harshly? And in this case, people kind of assumed a racist motivation on behalf of either the airlines or the people who were the security staff or others. But instead, there was a whole bunch of ideas that were coming out here. So in this case, this was looking at the Washington Post, and they were like, okay, there's an issue here that there's no real proper regulation for the airlines about who to kick off a flight. And in this case, they also looked at this and they found no evidence of race or nationality-based discrimination. But I'm like, still, why was he selected and asked to get off the plane? So they were talking about that there was no pattern here of rule breaking. So the idea is like, well, okay, if there's no pattern, then is there a policy? And how do people get selected? And who is doing the selection? So in this case, there's a slightly different one. So this happened to me 2 days later. And in this case, a passenger who had paid a full fare, $1,000, to fly first class from Hawaii back to Los Angeles, was threatened with handcuffs. He was sitting in first class, and they came along and like, you have to give up your seat. And he was like, I'm not giving up my seat. I paid for this seat. And so things got kind of testy, and security guards were called. And eventually, this is what happened, saying, okay, fine, we're just going to downgrade you to economy class as the solution. And then kind of to add insult to injury, they placed him in the middle seat between a married couple who were in the midst of a nasty fight and refused to be seated next to each other. And he states they argued the whole way back, nearly 6 hours. It was a lot of fun, right? So again, here we have somebody who's able to afford their full class ticket, and like, why were they selected? So this is, again, looking at kind of public discussion about this, and this is from Professor Julia Underwood, and she was talking about how these airlines are so locked into their policies. So she's not talking about patterns now. She's saying that there's these policies, that there's no room for empathy. And what I was interested in here was talking about that there was members of the crew there, they were apologizing, but they said they weren't able to do anything. Like, they weren't able to use common sense to try and work out how to solve this problem, which they typically should have been trained in. But this idea that we are at the mercy of this policy that we don't understand, and that we don't even know how it aggregates these ideas. And so somebody like Cathy O'Neill, who I know is controversial in the CHCI community for recent comments she made about how HCI is, or nobody is looking at algorithmic fairness or unfairness. So I put it in here saying this is like an airport read that a lot of people have looked at to get a sense of what is going on with these algorithms. And she talks specifically and wrote after this idea that it's really, and this kind of echoes Jenna's earlier talk about the nature of dignity itself, and like this idea of like, who is the lowest value customer? And I was very heartened when I started looking into this, because I travel a lot with 2 small children, that I'm least likely to be bumped, because mothers with kids are real pain in the asses and kick up fuss, and you just don't want that video, right, of the mom with the crying children. And then it also costs more, so good for me. But this idea of how they're selecting this lowest value customer, again, it's incredibly opaque. All right, so she's talking about, again, that she was on the 99% Invisible podcast, and she's saying that they're not evil, they're just really problematic because they're mysterious, they're destructive, and they're all over the place. So it's everything from my fairly minor inconvenience trying to get to Poland, which actually took me 36 hours, so maybe not so minor, But there are obviously these larger, serious social justice issues, again, that Jenna was talking about earlier, that are really, really deeply problematic. And again, I also think about where algorithms are kind of forcing or influencing public opinion. It's not just my little experience there, but also at the level of this guy, and more specifically for me as an Irish person, the level of this moron, and how they are using algorithms and all sorts of different ways to really kind of change and temper debate and kind of civic discourse. So there are kind of two questions that I've been interested in exploring, is this idea of, as a designer, how is AI some form of a material? How can I work with it in a sensible and purposeful and straightforward way? And also in these systems, again, thinking about not just these transactional systems where we do a lot of work and the algorithm gets smarter at giving us recommendations, but rather if I'm doing all that work, shouldn't I also get smarter? Shouldn't my experience also be enhanced? So this is some of the work I do in working in the design community and in healthcare. So last summer, together with some really wonderful colleagues who work on machine learning at Mayo Clinic, another colleague who works in kind of startups in engineering, Nora, who's actually a curator of art technology, and Alan Smeaton, who's a distinguished AI and machine learning professor. And we convened a conversation at the Design Research Society conference, which had anthropologists and designers and a lot of artists to come together and try and think about how they might understand and conceptualize this design material. So again, coming up with this idea over a multiple day experience, how can we think about this idea of enhancing the experience of the human actors specifically? And so again, I can't listen to this, play this, but we started by looking at things like in the movie Her. I'm now going to narrate this to you. There's a very evocative moment where he's talking to the AI agent that he's fallen in love with. And it kind of dawns on him all of a sudden that maybe his understanding of an operating system is quite different from what this kind of alien algorithm he's interacting with, when he discovers that this entity that he's in love with is actually also involved in over 11,000 other relationships. And then you begin to think about, wow, these algorithms, maybe they just move along and they conceptualize this human-machine relationship in such an alien and radically different way. And so this is a useful quote from Maciej Keglowski, who he's a really interesting thinker on this. And he talks about that there's no slot in the algorithm that says, insert your moral compass here. So he's saying, implying them to human beings, we open ourselves, we leave ourselves open to unpleasant surprises, like if we are under the mistaken belief that there should be a moral compass in there. So maybe he has a wonderful talk that I encourage you to listen to called Build a Better Monster. Anyway, see, these are some of the outcomes which are kind of probably very obvious and typical that came out of our discussion with these very diverse folks who are very interested in, like, is it going to be transparent? Am I able to read the data in accessible forms? How do I know if the data is reliable? What happens when something goes wrong? Again, mimicking a lot of some of the conversations from earlier today, that can we have options to participate in this? Some of the other things that came up that were a little bit more surprising were a really detailed conversation about nobody could agree, or maybe we said we agreed to agree that AI can be all of these things: subject, artifact, material, method, tool, and system. And some of the anthropologists there were very interested in this idea, like, well, maybe it's not negative. It would be wonderful for me as an anthropologist to create a bot that could do 20,000 interviews in a day. Wouldn't that be really useful for me? Or others coming at this idea that, oh, we are setting up a false dichotomy, too much a binary, like this is a human and this is a machine. Can we use the critical and theoretical and philosophical lenses of intersectionality or relationality or communality to think about AI in a kind of a shifted lens? And finally, there was some work about what would speculative and critical AI be within the lenses of critical design. So these are some ways that we go from public perceptions of these folk theories, I guess, about how these algorithms work, to ideas coming more from art and social science about some ways that we can begin to interrogate AI. So that's kind of one element of my work. The other is through healthcare. And so this is a group that I co-lead here at Virginia Tech on developing systems for interactive neurorehabilitation. And this is a subset of our group of about 40 people here at Carnegie Mellon and at Emory University in Arizona State. And so we have folks obviously from really, really different backgrounds all coming together. And what I want to talk about today is we haven't yet developed the AI for our system. We're building semi-automated systems for the home because we have a whole slew of things to solve before that. Okay, so I work primarily in stroke, which is, as I said, the most common neurological disorder worldwide. So after surgery and medical intervention or chemical intervention, it's left to therapy. Okay, but it's very expensive to go to therapy. It's hard to get there. So home-based therapy is an idea. Can we have a system that can give you therapy at home? This is great, but this, I work with the engineers, and they're like, well, let's put cameras in every room. And I'm like, you put cameras in every room in your house and see how you feel about that. Also, it's expensive, but the hardest thing is reproducing the therapist's supervision. Okay, so our goal is, can we create fairly cheap ones for the home that will motivate therapy, capture the movement correctly, and evaluate it coherently. So movement quality is a tricky one. So you can't quite hear the sound here. Well, these are two children I know pretty well. And what's fun about this is we can look and say, yes, the smaller one is trying to mimic the movement of the older one, and she wants her dress to go out. And we recognize that as potentially dancing, right? For running open pose on this is just like, I'm not sure if they're humans, right? And the shapes. So we can look at this, and so we're like, assessing movement quality is really, really challenging. So one of the things that we work on, we started out with these huge systems, right, which are great. They're very, very accurate at understanding kinematic information, but they're not something that you can feasibly put in the home, particularly of a stroke survivor who's not able to put objects on their body either. So one of the things that we've been working on in trying to think of this aspirational idea is, can we create these cyberhuman agents that help the patient get better, but also help the therapist in this case get better too? Okay. So we have these ideas that the human-machine co-development must be meaningful. In particular, we're looking at doing this in a very participatory, iterative way. So let's skip to this. This is the type of system we have right now, which has custom-designed objects, and we use this as a very simple camera setup. And working with the therapists who've worked over a considerable period of time with us in developing active protocols for manipulating these types of devices for upper extremity. So this, for example, is not necessarily, we don't do user tests right now. This is one of our ambassadors. So we have I work at Emory Hospital with about 15 patients there who are there to help us. This is a non-therapeutic intervention. Give us a lot of ideas and feedback about the systems, and they are fairly brutal. But in this case, the idea is that this is a system that would sit on your tabletop at home. The patient directs the whole interaction in terms of deciding when to turn on the camera to record what, in this case, what he is doing. So in the interest of time, I'll move forward, but some of the things that are useful for us to think about are having meaningful conversations with the therapist about where would cameras go in the home, how they would like to control them, how they want the data to go back to the therapist, and what to do when the feedback is incorrect. So one of the challenges for us with this system is saying you're 80% confident that that was done correctly is not adequate for the doctors. And so they're like, unless you're very, very sure that that was either done correctly and why, you have to give a different form of feedback. So those patients, for example, are saying, if you don't know, show me a video of me doing it correctly. You should have that already in the system, and that's the most useful form of feedback. So for this is the next problem that we have. So I've gone down there to Emory many times. We've collected lots and lots of data. Our problem is, how do you label that data? Okay, we need to label the data. And so we have created these interfaces for physiotherapists to come in, and they've developed an ontology, and they're labeling the data for us. We start to see things like this. One of the biggest problems, we're trying to create an automated system. The therapists fundamentally don't agree with each other about what they're seeing. It depends on their training, for example. So we look at this, and we have therapists who are much more inclined to go with the carrot and those who go with the stick. So we start out with 4 therapists, and it's just not adequate for us to get an alpha level of correlation. It needs to be at least about 80%. And right now, we are at 80% for some of them, but at others. So in response to looking at this data, we went back to them with these surveys saying, you fundamentally disagree here. You're giving different rankings and scores, and they continue to fundamentally disagree. So this is a challenge for us, is like, how can we get some sort of thing when the therapists themselves, their approaches are radically different, and how do we train maybe different types, different flavors of machine algorithms that fit the training profile and approach of a particular therapist? So this is where I was most recently. We're like, if we can't get 4 to agree, why don't we up the stakes and bring 12 in? And so this is what I did in working in Carillion Hospital. In this case, we're expanding from stroke to those with knee replacement. Again, how can we get folks to come in, start looking at this data, labeling it, and finally getting people to come together with some form of agreement? So this, to finish up, is ultimately where we really want to go. We have these systems, there's all these loops in it that we hope are enhancing the human experience as well, including for us as the system designers. We have our patient who is using things with the system, we give them good feedback. We also send ideas about the system to the training therapists, and then we have these labeling therapists down here. So it's a whole ecosystem that we're trying to build. And the one bit that this idea of like refining the algorithm, like we haven't even designed the algorithm yet because we have all these other parts to do first. But in this case, we're finding that therapists are getting really, really good at more precisely describing what it is that they're looking at and how to make that computable. And that's been kind of a real progress forward in just understanding what the nature of the problem is. So that's a very different approach for us to AI in that context. So that's me. Thank you.
We have time for questions when we switch speakers and computers.
I should take that off. Oh, hey.
That was a great talk. I wonder if you could talk more about sort of the virtues of this semi-automation, because it looks to me like this AI application that you are working on is multi-layered and spans over different places in the country and over time. And to some degree, I would assume that, especially in the sense of healthcare, that some sort of disagreement is good. It could be possibly a benefit of the patient. How do you plan on maybe sort of preserving that kind of feedback and sort of dynamic space in, like, as you sort of sophisticate the
Yeah, that's a good point about disagreement. One thing is the patients often disagree with the feedback as well. And it's quite funny when we run studies because I'm the person giving the instructions in the videos. So when I'm there, they're always like, why'd you give me that? I'm like, I didn't give it to you, the system gave it to you. But that's something we want to put into the system, that at the end of a session at home, the patient also annotates and evaluates their own experience. The reason it's semi-automated is that the information has to go back to the therapist every evening, and then they look at a summary of that and they can change and adapt the protocol. So the idea of a fully unsupervised system is not necessarily, the medical field is not happy with that right now, that there needs to be kind of some form of check-in. But we're very interested in the idea of the patient also being able to disagree with the system and help us train the attention model in a more appropriate way for their particular kind of disability. Sure, thanks.